Thank you for coming today. This is an important conversation to be having. I don't need to make it bigger than it is, but I think it's big enough on its own merit. But thank you for coming, being a part of this conversation, and this is a two-parter, so we'll be starting today and continuing on next week. For those that don't know, I'm Pastor Vern, and pleasure to be on the journey with you, and we are challenged together for how to be the church today and going forward in this changing landscape. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we give you thanks for your church. This is your church. You love this church. Your Son died for this church and raised it up to life. We ask you to be with us as we hear about changes and shifting patterns that are happening, and we're not sure how to respond. As we hear about churches that don't always get along with these kind of issues, we ask you to guide us, keep us, remind us of your love, give us strength and conviction for our journey, and most of all, to help us to learn and be faithful along the way. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. The world is in a very different place than it was at the end of World War II. Anybody want to disagree with that? Raise your hand now. The greatest generation came home from the war. They were genuine heroes and certainly honored as such. And America sprung back to life. And some of you still remember those days, I'm guessing, quite well. Mainline Protestants, including Lutherans and Methodists, Presbyterians and Episcopalians, enjoyed a prominent place in American culture. Sunday schools were filled to overflowing, and upwards of 40% of the population attended church every week. Now, I don't know if that's your story, but if your household and those households there were anything like mine, you put a pot roast in the oven before you went to church with potatoes and carrots, and you know what I'm talking about? And then you went to church, and then you went to Sunday school or vice versa, and then you came home afterwards and had potatoes and roast beef and carrots and maybe a slice of apple pie for dessert. And then you sat around all Sunday afternoon while you ate so much for dinner. But the world isn't like that anymore, is it? And families aren't like that anymore either, and for lots of different reasons. And I think just the fact that families are so much more spread out than they've ever been before is just a little indication of how much things have changed. I think the last several memorial services we've done, it seems like, you remember when people used to die, you did a service 3 days later, and you'd have a burial, and everybody would go back home. And now you have some of those services a month later, or 2 months later, or 3. Whenever it's convenient, and whenever families can find the time to get together for those important family times along the way. I'm not complaining about that, just an indication that the world is different, and our lives are different. Gallup has been studying polls since the 1930s and tracking worship attendance. And it was 41% in the 1930s, and for the last 70 years, it stayed right at about 40%. And then somebody got the bright idea because they looked around and said, okay, there's not as many people in the pews as there used to. What's the deal here? So somebody got the bright idea, instead of having Gallup call and ask, we should just add up the numbers of those that are recorded in their church as actually showing up on a Sunday. And what they found, surprise, surprise, is that it wasn't 41% that were coming to church. It was more like 17%. 17%. And that number was trending downward. And I think that was a huge wake-up call. I don't remember who started this conversation, but I remember reading that and just being shocked. Because I think America, for a long time, it felt like, well, at least we're not like Europe, where 5-10% of the people go to church. At least it feels like there's 30-40% of the population that are going. And then we woke up one day and realized it's closer to 17%. And again, the numbers were going down and not up. Now, some researchers quipped, I think in a humorous way, that when Gallup calls, everyone that picks up the phone, and I got called by Gallup, not about this, but about healthcare issues. I don't know, have you been called by Gallup, any of you? All right, they just called the special people, I guess. But anyway, they were calling me. They were asking about health care. It took them about 5 calls to get through to me. It was a number in Omaha, Nebraska, and they called me. We were talking. But when Gallup calls, this is the quip that was made, people just assume that grandma is listening in on the other end of the line. Did you go to church last Sunday? Well, yes, I went to church last Sunday. Basically, people were making it up. Or maybe they had an inclination to go and they didn't get there. But they assumed grandma had called. And so the statistics were really quite skewed when it came to who was actually there. And the fact of the matter is, I think for many of us, with our lifestyles and the ability to come and go and pick up and go visit grandkids and everything under the sun, we're not always here on Sundays, are we, anymore? Average worship attendance, I think, for a lot of people is like once a month, or maybe even once every couple of months. And that's not necessarily bad or good. It's just an indication that the world is different and times have changed, and we're not quite sure what to do about it. As I said earlier, Pastor Jason and I are beginning this conversation. Today we're going to talk about shifting landscape of culture and church. And it's a complicated topic. We'll barely reach the tip of the iceberg on this one, but it's worth talking about this conversation. And then next week, Pastor Jason has a new member class, but I'll be back and I'll be talking about some things we've been trying to do at Zumbro. And it's a Sunday. We didn't plan it this way. I'd like to think everything was planned out this well, but didn't plan it this way, but we're doing a survey, a worship survey. We'll be talking about things we've been trying in the church, things like narrative lectionary, things like the Big Idea Guide. We'll be getting and wanting feedback from you on how those things are working or not working as far as you see. A big part of the challenge, I think, is this. The future does not exist yet. We are caught up in a cultural force that's bigger than ourselves, and there's many things about it we do not understand. But we still ask the question, what are we supposed to do? Ed Catmull of Pixar, the group that makes all those animated, innovative movies, has this quote, and I think it's very helpful. There is a sweet spot between the known and the unknown, where originality happens. The key is to be able to linger there without panicking. We are in that sweet spot between the known and the unknown, where originality might happen. So what that will mean for our church and your church, not sure. But we'll talk about that. Have that thought in the back of your minds as we go through our conversation today. First, Pastor Jason and I are going to talk about the churches where we grew up along the way. I was born in 1955. That makes me a baby boomer. I was part of that generation that was born after the war. My dad didn't serve, but he certainly had brothers that did. My dad, as you probably remember, was a pastor of a couple of country churches in South Dakota, and that's where my formative years were spent. With 2 churches, one of them, Rosini Lutheran Church, was bigger and thriving. One of them, St. Peter Lutheran Church, was smaller and dwindling. Your coffee is ready. I got a thumbs up, so if you need to go, it's a bad day. Okay. St. Peter was smaller and dwindling. I went to a country school, 3/4 of a mile away from home. How many of you went to country schools? Quite a few of you. It's amazing how many people I've run into that did that. Mine was 3/4 of a mile away, and I'm guessing for you two that went, uphill both ways? Right? Boy, it was hard back then. And I also remember that at that time you couldn't get away with anything. There were adult eyes watching you at every turn. The larger church, Rosini Lutheran, had a lot of kids in Sunday school. After Sunday school, we all went up to church together. And one of the reasons my dad got called there is because they'd had a schism in the church, a split over a building project. Specifically, whether they should build a new parish head unit, and if they did build one, I'm not making this up, should they build it on the east side of the church or the west? And it ended up on the west side. There it is. No, that's the east side. Sorry. Oops, sorry. That's the east side. And literally dozens and dozens and dozens of families left the church over this issue. My dad got called there. He followed a pastor. We will mention his name 2 different times, and both times that pastor has split the church over a building project. Churches don't always get along about those things and lots of other things as well. Rosini Lutheran is still open today. My dad did his best to track down all those people that had left, and most all of them came back. So good for my dad for doing that. Rosini's still open. They're a lot smaller than they were, but they're still going, and I think in some ways going strong for a small little country church. A couple of my sisters are still there. One of them is the organist. They have a small Sunday school.
Where is that?
Where is that? It's near Beersford, rural Beersford. Yeah, south of Sioux Falls, about 40 miles. Thanks for asking. And I'm convinced for Rosini and lots of churches like this, one of the keys to longevity is their ability to be an inviting church. They have people that move in. The farms have gotten smaller, but there's a lot of country places that people will move in and they'll rent a space and in an old farmhouse. And Rosini was good about baking a plate of cookies and bringing it by and saying, why don't you show up some Sunday? And a lot of people have. And so they continue to plug along. They continue to have vitality. St. Peter, on the other hand, which is about 10 miles away, was more of a standoffish church. They were Haugean Norwegian. I don't know if any of you remember the Haugians, but no wine at communion, only grape juice, no robes and vestments for pastors. My dad wore a suit and a tie, and lots and lots and lots and lots of other rules that they had along the way. And they had one way of doing things as Haugians.
Is there anything wrong with that?
Yeah, I guess there was. I'm just getting to that, Phil. Anyway, the Haugean church got smaller and smaller and smaller. Eventually, my dad worshiped for 10 years with 4 people in the pews. And then they finally gave up the ghost and died and closed. And the ironic thing about that, they closed in the early 1980s. No, excuse me, in the late 1980s. And my dad was sick with cancer and in the hospital. And he was dying of cancer and wasn't able to be at the closing of that church. The only other thing I can tell you about that church, I could tell you lots of stories about that church, but Corinne Chilstrom, who was Hanson back in that time, grew up in that church. And her dad was the biggest pain in the neck that any pastor has ever had. What's said here stays here, okay? What's said here stays here. Pastor Jason.
He's really good at throwing me out of the bus. Just set me up so well. No. Pastor Vern mentioned being a child of the baby boom, and just so that we are clear about some generational things, it's helpful to have some sense of what are we talking about when we talk about generations. This is the first time in history where we have 6 living generations in society. And if you look at that, you think about, we have people, maybe not in 1901 so much anymore, but those born in 1925, there's certainly people, lots of active people who were still born in the 20s here. The glut of kind of mainline churches is in that next generation, traditionalists or silents. They're called silents because those who came before them, they fought the war, they built the nation back up, and those who were just a little bit younger just got to kind of sit down and listen and follow along. And there just wasn't a lot of room for innovation for those silents, the traditionalists. Baby boomers, obviously, many of you probably have children, family members who are boomers. Gen X. What's that? And baby boomers, yeah, absolutely. Gen X is 60s and 70s, that great cultural revolution. And then millennials, we hear probably a lot about millennials these days, certainly shaped by technology. They're also shaped by some of the early 2000s events like 9/11, and then Gen Z, or the boomlets. The boomlets, they call them the boomlets because that generation will be larger than the baby boomers. The difference is 49% of boomlets are people of color. So it's going to turn diversity upside down, you know. So I am a child of kind of two generations. I was born in 1979. Officially, those who were born in 79 and 1980 are called the Oregon Trail generation. We grew up playing Oregon Trail on Apple IIe's in the media center. So 1979. So I kind of sit kind of in the valley between two generations. I grew up in a small town of 10,000, St. Peter, Minnesota, at First Lutheran Church here, and it's a college town. So there's maybe a little different demographic than a traditional small town might have had. But when I was growing up, church was still pretty central to the community, right? It was still pretty much at the heart of what people did. There was still time crafted out on Sundays and Wednesdays for religious education, Christian religious education, obviously. And so, you know, we just kind of assumed that everyone went to church. We had a large Sunday school, but I don't know that I would have been in church had a few things not happened in my life. My mom was pretty young when I was born. She was 21, and by the time she was 24, she was divorced. And she didn't really feel all that welcome at a church. Didn't really think that there would be a place for her. And by the time I was about 4, 5 years old, she was remarried. But we didn't go back to church until my sister was born at the start of 2nd grade. By then, I think my mom felt like she could fit in. And that's when we started worshiping regularly, when I started going to Sunday school. First Lutheran Church had about 350 to 400 people in worship on a Sunday morning, 2 services, much like Zumbro, you know, education hour in between. And when I was confirmed with 31 8th graders, right? The confirmation classes were always bigger than the Sunday school classes because somehow when confirmation started, kids just showed up. And all of a sudden there were kids that I had no idea went to my church that were in my confirmation class, right? Because that was still just what you did. If you had kids, you got them confirmed. But things were certainly starting to change. Many of those kids who showed up for confirmation weren't around any other time, and by the time we were confirmed, they weren't there in the fall. By the time fall rolled around, there were 6 of the 31 of us still active in church, and that was only because we had the best middle school and high school choir in town, and we all sang. I didn't know it then, but looking back, I see that I grew up in a time when our culture was shifting away from placing the church at the center of society and moving more toward the edges. And I've seen that with my friends since then. Today, First Lutheran is still, you know, holding its own, but they have about 230 people in worship. And their last confirmation class was 9. So people aren't showing up with their kids anymore to get their kids confirmed. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not sure what value it is to just kind of drop in and then pull out and not have much connection otherwise. But it's certainly a shift that's happened.
We're going to give you just a couple of minutes to turn to a person sitting next to you and talk a little bit about where you grew up along the way. What kind of church was it in? And go ahead, find a neighbor. I'll give you 1 minute to talk about this. 1, 2, 3, go.
Well, I grew up actually in northern
Which one was it? Right?
And I went to a country school.
All right, let me call you back.
I grew up in Rochester, at a Missouri Synod Church.
Let me call you back.
It's not ringing, is it?
I just saw it.
So who wants to tell maybe a couple of quick stories about the church in which you grew up? I wish we had time for more, but who wants to tell a quick story about that? You got one right here.
It was a small church in South Dakota, and everybody took roll, and if you didn't show up, somebody spoke to you.
Okay, so you took roll. Were you there every week? You better be, absolutely. Yes?
Well, at a small church in rural Nebraska, and in the annual report, what everybody gave was in there. And so
Those were the good old days.
those were the days.
They were.
So you didn't want to miss a chance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
I might be an exception because when my father retired from the Marine Corps, I was 5 years old. We moved to Tucson, Arizona, and we were part of a mission congregation, an ELC mission congregation.
Okay.
And that's really was the church that I was raised in, and there was no membership, I mean, taking down anything like that. It's so foreign to what everybody else did.
So that would have come out of the Norwegian Lutheran Church. Yeah. How old are you, Paul? No, I'm just kidding. Anybody else? Maybe one or two more.
Hi.
We got one.
Oh,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I grew up at First Lutheran in Blooming Prairie, Minnesota. And when I was a little kid, our minister, all he did was yell at everybody for not anybody else coming to church. And my father happened to be somebody that had something to do with the administration or whatever. And I remember when I was about 9 saying, can we get rid of him?
You were how old?
About 9. I've
About
always
9.
been outspoken. Anyway, to my father, not in church, but then we got Pastor Alf Rumstead.
Oh, okay.
And the church came alive, and we
Okay.
even talked to the Catholics at the other end of the block.
Oh, he even talked to them. Okay.
Yeah, we did then,
That was
but not
pretty-
before.
Pretty radical. Deb, been talking any more about getting rid of certain pastors lately? You okay with that? All right, we have time for one more.
Okay. Well, by a little contrast, I grew up in a very large congregation. It was in Golden Valley, Minnesota, a growing suburb of Minneapolis. When I was baptized, there were 200 members. When I was confirmed, there were 4,000. And I had 100 in Calvary Lutheran Golden Valley. I had 103 in my confirmation class. 10 were Johnsons. And when we went to get our robe, there were 2 R Johnsons. So Randy and I had to figure out whose was which. But we had the largest Sunday school in the ALC, and it was a fantastic place to grow up. Very fortunate.
And I'm glad you mentioned a large church, because even today, the trending pattern is for people to join larger churches. Mega churches and congregations like that have a natural, I think, advantage over small country churches where everybody's taking roles along the way as you go along. Well, we're going to move on. I'd love to hear more of your stories. We're going to move on and talk a little bit about some of the trends in our culture today. There are a lot of different ways that people talk about some of those trends, but you've probably heard of 2 of them. The duns and the nuns. Have you heard of those? The duns tend to be those people that I think have gotten fed up with the church and have simply walked away. Certainly some of those people that were in Rosini Lutheran that never did get back on board about the Prairie Shed unit became duns long before we talked about those kind of things. And you can imagine any number of reasons for those things to happen. And then the nuns, there's a growing number of folks who check none of the above when it comes to religious demographic information. They don't necessarily identify themselves as religious or Christian along the way. Now, I'm going to talk about these things just in a little bit more detail. Another way to refer to the Duns is those people that love Jesus, but not the church. Have you heard that phrase along the way? They love Jesus, but not the church. I think most of us instinctively get this. Anybody that spends any time around imperfect people gets this. It's hard to be the church. We can fight about anything from how to make the coffee and who's going to serve the coffee. And just on down the line, it's hard to be the church. Nearly half of Americans today are not connected with the institutional church. That's half. Yet the majority of those people still believe in God and practice some sort of faith beyond its walls. And a lot of those people still identify themselves, at least in some sense, as lovers of Jesus or followers of Jesus along the way. But again, not in the church. About general age range for this, 33 to 70. There's a lot of people in that range. So baby boomers on down to Gen Xers, or even millennials along the way. 60% are women, 40% are men. About as many Republicans as Democrats. We don't agree on many things, but I guess they agree on this thing, okay? They're going to love Jesus, but not the church in equal amounts. Most have a fairly orthodox view of God. You created the world, all-knowing, all-powerful, creator of the universe, and still rules today. And most are positive about religion. And they consider themselves to be spiritual people. They might pray. A lot of them do pray. They might read the Bible. A lot of them do, but not as many as traditional Christians. They might read books on spiritual topics. They might attend a retreat from time to time. They tend to find God in nature and things like yoga, meditation, solitude. Their spirituality is deeply personal, and they prefer to keep it to themselves. They tend to be fairly private about their spirituality. Now, another way, that's the Duns. Another way to refer to the group, the nuns, is spiritual, but not religious. Bet you've heard of that a lot, haven't you? Spiritual, but not religious. Most of this group have little or no connection with the church. They tend to be more moderate or progressive when it comes to politics. They're as likely to understand God as some sort of higher consciousness than as some sort of personal deity with whom we can be in a relationship. They tend to have ambivalent views of religion, or even negative views of religion. They see it as harmful. I mentioned to a few of you that I saw the movie recently called A Case for Christ. Interesting film. It's about a man named Lee Strobel. It's a true story. He was an writer for the Chicago Tribune, and he was an atheist, and basically thought that religion and the church were harmful kinds of things. Eventually he became a Christian, a long story, but a good story. And but it's not hard to find folks out there that are either agnostic or atheist and proud of it, and are willing to see the church as part of the problem, as harmful today. A large percentage in this group of the nuns see all religions as kind of the same. They teach basically the way to God, it's up a mountain, and good luck getting there kind of stuff. And that's basically how they understand the religion that they're not all that crazy about. And they tend to find their spiritual nourishment a lot like the Duns, with things like nature and yoga and meditation and solitude. I told the story before, but it bears repeating. My brother Johann was out of the church for quite some time in his life, and he happened to live a half a block away from me. And he was living with another brother, Timothy. But Johann had a lot of friends that gathered around the house, and we used to go back and forth borrowing tools. We shared a lawnmower together, so I was regularly down there. And on more than a few occasions, I would show up on a Friday night to mow the lawn, because what else you want to do on a Friday night when you don't have a social life? And so I'd be down there borrowing the lawnmower, and there would be my brother on the back patio with his friends, and they'd be drinking a beer, having a good conversation, spirited. And there was generally a good mood in the group. And then usually my brother would introduce me to that group. And when they found out I was a pastor, and that's always the question, do you want to tell people what you do? But invariably, they wanted to talk about God. And right behind it, they kind of wanted to talk about the church, too, for perhaps some good reasons and also some bad reasons. The conversations were always respectful, but definitely lively. I didn't take any polls, but if I were to hazard a guess, about half of them were in the group who loved Jesus but not the church. Something happened along the way. They believed in God. They thought highly of Jesus, but they shared painful stories about their families, things that happened along the way, things that turned them off to the whole business of religion. And those stories, I think, are not hard to find. You know that. And for them, it meant that they had little choice, or their families had little choice but to leave. I'm not necessarily agreeing with that, but that's just the way that logic works a lot of the time. And I'd say the other half of the group that were there were in the spiritual but not religious camp. They believed in God. It was barely evident. Perhaps God was some sort of higher power. Perhaps not. But their beliefs weren't having any immediate impact in their daily lives as far as I could tell. So back in those days, we didn't have the same categories that we have today. So I sort of all lumped them all together and referred to them as my brother's happy pagan friends. I meant no disrespect by it. And it was handy, though. It was simply a way to characterize a whole group of people that didn't act like me or think like me, and I wasn't always sure what to do with. And over again, I was surprised, though, at how open they were to talk about God and God's relationship to our world. Anybody know anybody like that in those groups? Lots of folks. I'm guessing you do. Maybe they love Jesus but not the church. Maybe they are spiritual and not religious. And let's be honest, some of those folks are in our own families. They're our children, and they're our grandchildren. And that makes it more personal and painful.
I want to share just a little bit. I tend to be the numbers guy on staff and the numbers pastor. So they're a little bit tight. Sorry to those in the back. I tried to make them as large as I possibly could. But obviously there's some emerging patterns here, right? This is happening, and it does seem to be generational. This graph is a generational replacement that is driving this unaffiliated, spiritual but not religious decline, particularly mainline and Protestants. Guess what, folks? We're part of the mainline, right? And if you look across generations, fourth line down, the percentage of silent generation folks born in late 20s to right up through the World War II, 22% were part of the main line. Today it's 11%. We're at half with younger millennials, 10%, so 10.5% between millennials. They're starting to separate out older and younger millennials. I guess we know more about them, or they've come of age, and so you start to see some of this breakdown. But and so Christianity as a whole is not as common among different generations. So this is happening, and so I think it raises good questions for us to say, so what does this mean, right? It doesn't mean that the church is necessarily dying. 70% of Americans still claim Christianity as a religion, as their religion, right? Now, Gallup the Pew Forum came out with a new study just last summer about why people attend church these days. And they found that 51% of Americans are regularly attending worship. Now that doesn't line up with what Pastor Vern was saying at the beginning, right? Regularly attending worship means anywhere from weekly or multiple times a week to every 6 or 8 weeks. So you got 50% of the people holding on to a faith tradition and a community in some way. And then the other half are not attending at all. Interestingly, though, they found that 27% of those people, so about half of the half that are attending worship, are attending more frequently than they used to. And so I think one of the things that tells us is that there is a spiritual hunger out there in our society. You know, people are looking for meaning and purpose. They're looking for community, perhaps. They're looking for ways to navigate this increasingly complex world. And some people are turning to a faith community to do so. That's a little bit encouraging to me. You know, it's encouraging to me. When you break this down by age, you also see, I think, that those who are attending more frequently, their lives are simplifying a little bit. Maybe they've retired. Maybe their kids have finally left the nest. You know, so that they're not being pulled in quite so many different directions. But that's not all of that, but certainly some things to consider. And those who are not attending, most have, more than half of them never attended, haven't really ever been part of a faith community, and now 22% are worshiping less often. So we're not dying, but there are some gaps in some of these numbers. When you think of 70% of Americans consider themselves Christians, and half say they're regularly worshiping, and 17% are actually in worship on a given Sunday. It shares some of the diversity of what people think that means to be Christian, right? There's not one uniform answer for that. So here's what the Pew Forum found on what people are looking for in a church. Quick survey. What do you think the number one thing people are looking for in a church if they're looking for a new church? Community. I heard community. What else? Other guesses? Pastors. Music. Youth program. Welcoming. Huh? Coffee. There's probably better options down the street at Starbucks. I don't know. Okay, so here's what they found. Sermons, quality of sermons, far exceeded. And when you split this out by those who are boomers and older, that number was quite a bit less, actually. Those who are millennials who are looking for a church, it was nearly 90%. So those younger people who are looking for a church are looking for meaning. They're looking for answers. They're looking for something to help them make sense of the complexity and diversity of this world, right? Feeling welcomed. Sharon, who's like our captain of welcoming, gets that one. Style of worship. It doesn't really matter, they found that whether it's contemporary or more traditional, they care about the quality of that style of worship. And then location. And location of all of these top four, younger people cared about these things much more. Older people, not so much. And then you get to education for kids. Those with kids, that number was higher. Those who are like probably emerging parents, those who are 18 to 29, didn't care about this as much as those who were 65 and older, which I thought was interesting, And then having friends and family, having connections, right? And then opportunities for serving, and then there was 29% that had other ideas. But this tells us something about where maybe our attention could be. For those who are looking for a church, how are we attending to that? Location, you can't really help unless you're going to really do fruit basket upset, right? But it does matter. And particularly for Catholics, 3/4 to 80% found that location for them because of the Catholic system where you go to a parish and you just go to the church that's closest to to your home, that's still very much part of the mentality of the Catholic Church. Yeah.
Is it true that growing evangelical churches tend to have longer sermons?
Phil asked, is it true that growing evangelical churches tend to have longer sermons?
Yes.
Yes. The answer is yes. And not just length, but it's also the type, like the purpose of sermons.
Maybe 30 to 40 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, Jim.
Did you have adult education on the other chart, the one before this? I couldn't quite figure out.
No. No, so education for adults was not really present.
Part of the problem.
Right. In fact, I was looking at a study earlier this week that looked at the Pew Form's 2014 landscape of religious life in America, and they have stats for Minneapolis and Minnesota, and I think it was 68% of those who attend worship regularly do no Bible study. It was about 11%, I think, 9 to 11% that were actually doing some kind of educational piece in their churches. So, yeah. And it's maybe one of the reasons that evangelical churches spend 40 minutes in their sermons and teaching straight on. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to keep moving because we got lots. This is for you. For the purposes of raising our awareness of what's happening in our own tribe, right? In the ELCA and predecessor churches. At our height, Lutherans, part of the ALC, LCA, that group of folks, in 1965, it's the highest baptized membership we ever had, almost 5.9 million Lutherans. Today, or 2015, it was 3.6 million. It's a net loss of almost 38%. Couple things about this. First, Lutherans tried really, really hard for a really long time to make it into the main line. And, the main line grew. Presbyterians, Methodists, Episcopalians, Lutherans, we boomed with the boom, right? And the flavor of Christianity that was booming at that time was a flavor of Christianity that we're all very familiar with. And in the 1960s, as Cultural Revolution happened, as lots of things started to change, the flavor and the tone of Christianity started to change as well, right? And so the evangelical surge, the religious right movement, and you might think that evangelicals are still growing like crazy. They're trickling down. They're shrinking, not nearly as fast as the main line. But one of the reasons this researcher surmises this is that they've held their own a little bit more, is that not only are they a religion, they're also a subculture. They've created a subculture of schools and of politics and of community where they've set them in many ways. They're a little more set up against or outside of the main culture. Whereas the main line has always tried to kind of, I think, be in the same stream with the broader culture in many ways. So those are some of the things that are deeply affecting us. As membership shrinks, we're also seeing huge shifts in leadership. I graduated from Luther Seminary in 2006. I was the second to the largest class they'd seen in like 25 years. The class right behind me was the largest. We had almost 900 students on campus, and it felt like we were in this new renaissance. We just figured that something phenomenal was happening. The Holy Spirit was up to something, and the church was maybe going to grow even. There were young people showing up to seminary, people excited, and I've been part of a research project at Luther now for the last couple years, talking about adult faith formation. We'll talk about that on May 14th, so come back. And the campus has shrunk by 38%. There's less than 600 students on campus, and the vast majority of them are distributed learning students who are working in churches all over the country. I'm teaching a class, or I'm leading a precept group this semester. At Luther, I have a student who's in Thailand, one who's in Indiana, one's in North Dakota, one's in Washington, one's in the Twin Cities, and one's in Fargo. None of them are on campus a whole lot. And it's creating some consternation among church leadership. And Dave Larson can probably speak to this as much as anyone, but the average pastor in the ELCA is 61 years old. That means for the next 14 years, over 400 pastors a year will retire. And there, at most, right now, are 200 new pastors being ordained a year. You know, when a church would have an opening for a pastor would leave, and the call committee would be formed, and they were excited. They'd talk to the synod. They'd say, "Hey, send us 4 or 5 names, and we'd love to see these profiles." And they used to be able to do that. And now a church is sometimes lucky to get 1 or 2 names to look at a time, because there's just not enough supply. Now, there's a lot of conversation about, do we have too many congregations? You know, ELCA is still largely rural, and we know that there's huge shifts happening in rural America, that population is flowing away, and you have churches like Pastor Vern's dad's church that has 4 or 6 or 8 people sitting in it on a Sunday morning, right? Is that where we need to put resources in the church with people who have 8 years of postgraduate education? Or are there caring, supportive, intelligent, connected people in these communities that can lead these communities vitally? You know, lots of questions. Okay, so the questions is the church dying, or is it rising again? Certainly, you've heard today that structures associated with the church are not as solid as they once were, right? Membership's on the decline, giving's on the decline, congregations are aging, there's not as many pastors. Certainly feels a little like death. But I also think that you can say, like manufacturing and industry in America, the church is not going back to the 1960s. Those same jobs, it's a different world we live in, right? We're not going to recreate what once was. We have to stand in that tension to see what kind of originality and creativity emerges. And church is no longer the center of the broader culture. People consciously now choose to belong to a church. There's no more social pressure. And I don't necessarily think that's a good or a bad thing, but it's interesting. People are now just choose to be part of a church and are maybe more intentional about that. A couple of other things. As far as the spiritual but not religious, the percentage of people who are open to a spiritual journey does not follow affiliation trends. I think that's interesting. People are still hungry for spirituality, right? Still hungry for meaning. And by and large, the nuns and duns are not hostile to faith. They're more non-committal, right? More non-committal. I have a lot of friends who have nothing to do with the church. I have a couple friends who engage me in open dialogue about faith and why I'd ever want to be part of the church and lead the church. She has been so, she has tried so hard for so long to understand the church community and has wanted to be part of it, but she cannot, given what she sees. And so she challenges me to think about what it is that I'm committed to. And I wonder if this is a time in our life together as Christians in America for us to deepen our own understanding and commitment to what we believe and how we live that out in ways that give life to others. Right? I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Vern.
Nadia Boltz-Weber was at Luther College a couple, 3, 4 weeks ago. Some of you went, a busload of you went. Paul Godland went to that, and he sent me a quick summary, and I want to share 2 of the points. I wasn't there, but I share 2 of the points. God brings live things out of dead things. So we shouldn't yearn for things that once were good. Perhaps life will come out of the death of what was once the church of the 1950s. Now that's stark. That's not Abel Weber. She doesn't mince words, does she? And then the second thing, our definition of success might need to shift. Preach the gospel, share the sacraments, proclaim forgiveness. That's our job, and no one else will do it. We have job security. These are worthwhile points. They help put things in perspective, I think. But they also remind us that just on the edge of this are stories like St. Peter Lutheran Church, dwindling numbers of people. And we're wondering if and what the cost will be for those people that have been part of those churches. This is loss. This is pain. This is struggle. And these are more than simply statistics. This is real pain that we experience on that journey together. I mentioned before that when St. Peter closed, my dad was in the hospital, and I was there, and it wasn't even my primary church. Rosini was my primary church, but I was there. I felt the need to go, and I felt that pain with them as they said goodbye and closed the doors and moved on with their story. So here's the question. We come out of rich religious traditions. We want to keep doing those traditions. So what parts? We've been doing the same tried and true things for a long time. Do we keep doing those things even though they seem to be less and less effective? I don't have a good answer for that, but I want to be part of that conversation with you. It's important. You've heard the definition of insanity, at least one of them, doing things over and over again, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And in some ways it feels like that's going on in the church these days. Doing the same things over and over again. I just wish things could be different. I often play golf with a friend, Rolf Olson, on Mondays up in the cities. And anybody here connected with Richfield Lutheran Church? Well, you can't say anymore, okay? This is the story of Richfield, at least a little bit of the story of Richfield. Rolf has been a pastor there, I think, for a dozen years or so. And about a year ago, they hired some consultants from the Kairos organization to come and do some consulting with them. Richfield is in the south end of Minneapolis, and back in the day it was in Richfield. And they probably average age maybe 83, 4, 5 years old. Haven't had a Sunday school for a long, long time. Still worshiping about 90 people on a Sunday. Lots of vitality in that church. But they were looking down the road, so they thought, let's talk about this with some folks at Kairos. And so they invited them in. And in the middle of the consulting, they were approached by a Seventh-day Adventist church that was in South Minneapolis. And almost out of the blue, now, Seventh-day Adventists worship on what day of the week? Saturday. So you know your churches. They were interested in buying this building. Don't ask me how they found out about this building, but they said, hey, we want to buy your building. We'll give you $2 to $3 million. What do you think? Wouldn't that be an interesting scenario? Would be if they came to us and said, hey, we want to buy Zumbro. We'll give you $3 million. Would we take it or not? Let's not go there right now. But you know where we're going here. The majority in the congregation, I think, were really in favor of this possibility. They liked hearing it. They were open to the possibilities that they were hearing from Kairos, that perhaps they'd reached a certain age, perhaps they were beyond the tipping point, perhaps they could not recover who they were going forward, so they might need to think about closing. Again, those aren't easy things to hear. Well, that was the majority. But after that, there was a minority group of people, maybe about a dozen, happened to be a slight majority of council members that couldn't begin to think about closing their doors and losing their future. And they even started whispering, unofficially, of course, about maybe the need to bring in a new pastor. You know what I'm talking about, don't you, Gloria? Yeah. It goes that way sometimes. They wanted their church to turn around. They wanted not to give up without a fight. And they even went to the point of proposing a capital campaign to help fund this new mission. Now, I don't usually refer to capital campaigns that way, but this became new monies to come in, to bring staff, to reach out, to not give up on their church, but instead go forward and dream big dreams and see what God might do in a new day. Now, those things don't sound bad, do they? So anyway, Rolf and I talk about these things on Monday when we go golfing, and that's why we don't keep score. It's just easier when you're golfing and getting into these kind of conversations. Now, between you and me, Rolf, good friend of mine, and the church knows it now too, but he's decided to retire. He's 63. He's had enough. This is hard choices to decide what to do and to know where to go forward and whether you should take on that 18, 20 people and have your church council about these kind of fundamental issues or what a church should do in these changing times. I've had lots of opinions that I've shared with Rolf, most of them that you won't hear out of my mouth, but you can tell it's personal and it becomes public and it affects a lot of people, and there aren't easy answers. I keep going back to that quote from Ed Catmull of Pixar. There is a sweet spot between the known and the unknown where originality happens. The key is to be able to linger there without panicking. I think Rolf, between you and me, has in some ways gotten tired, and in some ways has panicked and said, I don't want to do this anymore. And that's the pain too. It not only affects the churches, but their leaders as well. And what do we do? How do we go forward? And where is God leading us going forward? Well, on that positive note, that's what we're talking about. We've been talking about this at the council the last couple months. They're going to watch this forum if they're not already here at this. We're going to be talking and in many ways at Zumbro going forward. Like I said, we're doing a survey next week. We'll talk about this next week as well, and trying to figure out how to be the church and how to be faithful to the Lord of the church in these uncharted waters that we're in. We've got about 3 minutes for you to wrap things up with everybody, okay? So if you got any questions, we'll come back next week. We'll spend a little less time big picture and a lot more time focusing on Zumbro and some things we've been trying at Zumbro. And again, I'm willing to try a lot of different things, but not all of them are going to work. I'm telling you that off the top of my head. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Yes, Nancy?
Have you looked at any of the churches that are successful in growing?
All the time. Have we looked at churches that are successful and growing? All the time. You know, I've spent a lot of time at Adam Hamilton's Church-Resurrection in Kansas City. That is a great example of a church that's not an evangelical church. It's a mainline church. It's a Methodist church that has found ways to grow. Again, different story than Zumbro has. They're 25 years old and not 152 years old. We got more layers of tradition and than they do. But yeah, we certainly pay a lot of attention to growing churches. But you can't just automatically transfer one to the other, but you can learn from them. Mike?
So is that growth intentional? Was it a planned growth? Or was
At Resurrection?
Yeah, or was it growth that happened because of what they were doing already?
Yes and yes. It was certainly a lot of intentionality about it. Adam Hamilton started by, you're going to laugh at this, going and finding the names of visitors, giving them coffee cups, and praying with them. And so lots of welcome. And they just wanted people to feel welcome. Not everybody's going to feel welcome or even feel like they belong in your church, but it was all about welcome and walking with people. And a lot of it since that time has certainly been an intentionality about what they're doing. A lot of sermons that last 40 minutes, a lot of teaching in those sermons. They have some tradition. It's not like it's all a contemporary church. There's some tradition, some contemporary, variety of ways to do worship. But yeah, it's worked in their setting. It has. Other questions, comments? Yes?
With the Destination Medical Center conversation, are the churches involved in any way, in significant ways?
Certainly been part of conversations, and Jason, you want to talk at all about that?
Is there a specific kind of angle you're looking for, how we've been involved?
Has there been any invitations to be involved?
Oh, sure.
In the conversation?
Yeah, certainly, and I mean, there's a lot of the work, or a lot of the involvement has been with churches trying to kind of be a moral and an ethical voice in the midst of development. It hasn't been, okay, how are we going to draw all these people in? What's going to be our plan? But it has been, okay, you're talking about housing, talking about transportation, how are we going to include everyone in this community? So that's been probably where there's been more energy, more effort put. There's an organization called In the City for Good that has kind of bubbled up grassroots and led by churches.
We're going to have to call it good at that. We'll have more conversation next week, more specifics related to Zumbro. Thank you for coming and being a part of this conversation.